Orison when Margaret Catherine Sullivan walked to the wooden gate of her family's farm. In her left hand, she held a photograph. The edges were soft from handling the image fading at the corners. Her brother James smiled up at her forever, 25 forever in his Marine Corps dress uniform. Forever 8 weeks away from a beach in Normandy, where German bullets would end his life. The morning air already carried Texas heat. Margaret tasted dust on her tongue, felt sweat beginning at her temples despite the early hour. The photograph trembled slightly in her grip. Not from fear, from fury barely contained. In the distance, a dust cloud rose from the county road, getting closer. The rumble of a diesel engine cut through the stillness, coming to bring her the thing she'd been dreading for 3 weeks. The thing the War Labor Board had mandated. The thing that made her want to scream. German prisoners of war, 12 of them, coming to work her land. Margaret was 28 years old enough to manage a 300-acre farm when every able man in the county had shipped overseas, old enough to understand that wartime required sacrifice. But this felt like the government asking her to shake hands with her brother's murderers. The telegram sat folded in her dress pocket. She'd received it June 27th. 61 days ago. 61 days of grief so raw it felt like drowning. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, First Lieutenant James Patrick Sullivan, was killed in action in defense of his country. Clean words for violent death. Official words that meant James would never come home, never practice medicine like he'd planned. Never marry the girl in Dallas who still wrote letters not knowing he was gone. The truck appeared through the heat shimmer. Army green canvas stretched over the back. Through the gap, Margaret saw them. Gray uniforms, dirty faces. 12 men who might have been at Normandy, might have been behind the machine guns, might have killed James. Her father stood beside her. Franklin Burns Sullivan, 55 years old, shoulders still broad despite decades of farm work. He'd fought in the Great War comeback in 1918 with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that still woke him some nights. He knew what she was thinking. He always did. Maggie girl. Just those 2 words, steady, calm. She shook her head, couldn't trust herself to speak. The truck's brakes squealed. Dust settled slowly. The driver climbed down, a corporal with Tennessee in his accent and apologetic eyes. "Morning, Miss Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan." He touched his cap. "Got your work detail. 12 men as ordered." "We didn't order anything," Margaret said. Her voice came out harder than intended. "No, ma'am. War Labor Board did. Farms with critical production get POW labor. Regulations." He pulled out a clipboard. "They work sunrise to sunset 6 days weekly. Sundays off. You provide midday meal and water. No fraternizing, no gifts, no personal conversations beyond work instructions. And if we refuse..." The corporal shifted his weight. "Can't refuse, ma'am. Wartime necessity. We need the food production. These prisoners, they're what we've got for labor." Franklin's hand settled on Margaret's shoulder. Heavy. Grounding. "How long they been stateside?" "Came through New York 3 weeks back. Processing camp in Houston since then. These 12 got captured in North Africa mostly. Been prisoners 4 or 5 months. Margaret looked past him to the canvas-covered truck. She could see faces now through the gap. Young faces, exhausted faces. One of them couldn't be older than 19, stared at the farmhouse with eyes that seemed too large for his thin face. "Let them out!" she said. The corporal walked to the truck gate, unlocked it. "Raus schnell!" 12 men climbed down slowly, stiffly. Wrist chains clinked softly in the morning quiet. Margaret noticed details she didn't want to notice. How thin they were, ribs visible through their uniforms. How their boots were worn nearly through. How some of them looked at the green fields with something like hunger. One man stood different from the others. Taller, maybe 6 feet, with the rigid bearing of an officer even in a prisoner's uniform. Sharp features, cold eyes, jaw set like concrete. This one still believed. You could see it in every line of his body. Still believed in the Reich. Still believed Germany would somehow win. Still believed Americans were soft, weak, unworthy. His name tag read Mueller. But it was another prisoner who made Margaret's breath catch. Younger, maybe 24, 25. Thinner than the rest, if that was possible. His gray uniform hung on him like scarecrow clothes, but his eyes were what struck her. Not cold like Muller's, not hard, just empty. Like a man who'd seen too much and couldn't unsee it. Like someone who'd stopped believing in anything at all. His name tag read Weber. The corporal lined them up. 12 men in the climbing heat. The youngest, the one who'd stared at the farmhouse, swayed slightly. Margaret wondered when any of them had last eaten a full meal. "These men have some English," the corporal explained. "Muller there, he's ranking NCO. He translates when needed." He turned to the prisoners, switched to German. "Dies is Sullivan Farm. Sie werden hier arbeiten, verstehen?" "Ja," Muller said. His voice was iron. "We are verstehen." The corporal handed Margaret a folder. "Work assignments, regulations, emergency contacts, MP stations 8 miles south. But you won't need them. These men know the consequences." Engines starting. Truck pulling away. Dust rising again. And Margaret stood facing 12 German soldiers. 12 men who wore the same uniform as the ones who'd killed James. 12 enemies on her land. 7 weeks ago, she'd wanted every German dead. Had screamed it into her pillow at night. Had imagined burning cities, destroyed armies, absolute vengeance for every drop of James's blood. Now 12 of them stood in her yard waiting for orders. Franklin stepped forward. "Gentlemen." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd been to war and understood things civilians didn't. "You'll work the South Fields today, cotton picking, simple work. My daughter will show you the tools, explain the system. Work hard, you'll be treated fairly. Cause trouble, the MPs handle it. Clear?" Muller translated rapidly. The men nodded, all except Weber, who just stood there staring at nothing. "This way," Margaret said. Started walking toward the barn, didn't look back. Heard their footsteps following, the clink of chains, the shuffle of worn boots on hard Texas soil. The barn was cool inside, dim after the bright sun. It smelled of hay and old wood and 3 generations of farm work. Margaret pointed to cotton sacks stacked against the wall. "Each man takes 1 sack, fill it, bring it back. We weigh it, empty it, you get another. Water break every 2 hours, midday meal under the oak tree out back." Muller translated. The men moved to collect sacks, all except Weber. He'd stopped, was staring at something on the wall. James's photograph. The larger copy Franklin had hung there. James in his uniform. James smiling that smile that had charmed every girl in 3 counties. James who would never smile again. Weber's face changed. Just for a second, something moved behind those empty eyes. Recognition. Pain. Shared grief, maybe. "Are a brooder?" he asked quietly. Your brother Margaret felt ice in her chest. "Don't!" Her voice shook. "Don't you dare speak about him." Weber looked down, nodded once, took a sack and walked out into the sunlight. The morning stretched long and brutal under the August sun. Margaret tried to work inside, tried to focus on accounts and production reports and the endless paperwork of wartime farming. But she kept drifting to the window, kept watching them work the distant fields. They moved like men who understood hard labor. No wasted motion, efficient, professional. Muller walked the rows like a sergeant on inspection, maintaining discipline even here, even as prisoners on enemy soil. The youngest one, Margaret had heard someone call him Hans, worked slower than the others. Not from laziness, from weakness. He was starving. They all were, but Hans looked closest to collapse. At 10 o'clock, Franklin took water to them. Margaret watched from the kitchen window. Watched them drink like men who'd been thirsty for months. Watched Weber cup water in his hands and splash it on his face, eyes closed, face tilted toward sky like he was praying. Questions came unbidden. Where had these men fought? Which battles had any of them been at Normandy on June 6th when James died? Did they have families? Mothers waiting for letters, sisters wondering if they'd ever come home. And the question she hated most. If James had been captured instead of killed, would some German woman be watching him work her fields right now? Hating him the way Margaret hated these men, at noon Franklin set up the meal under the old oak tree. Not much. Sandwiches with the last of the ham, apples from last year's harvest, water. But it was food, real food, more than most of Europe was seeing. Margaret carried the basket out herself, didn't know why, could have sent her father, could have left it and walked away, but she carried it to the wooden table under the spreading branches. The 12 men were already there. Sitting in shade, silent, Mueller stood slightly apart, always watching, always enforcing invisible rules. "It's not poisoned," Margaret said, sharper than necessary. "Just food. Take what you need," Mueller translated. The men moved forward, slowly at first uncertain, then faster as they saw what waited. Real bread, real meat, food that wasn't thin soup or moldy potatoes. Hans took a sandwich with shaking hands. The youngest prisoner couldn't be more than 19, stared at it like he'd forgotten what real food looked like. Weber came last, always last, like he didn't deserve to be first, like he was trying to disappear into the background of his own existence. He picked up a sandwich, held it, studying it with an expression Margaret couldn't read. Then he bit into it, and something in him broke. His face crumpled, shoulders shook. He was crying, actually crying, this thin German soldier crying over ham and bread while his fellow prisoners watched in uncomfortable silence. "Was ist los?" Mueller barked. "What's wrong?" Weber couldn't answer, just shook his head, kept crying, kept eating. An older prisoner, maybe 40, spoke quietly. Hat seit 2 Jahren nicht so gegessen. He hasn't eaten like this in 2 years. Margaret felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built between herself and these men. She looked at Weber, at Ernst. She'd heard someone call him and saw past the uniform, saw the hunger, the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd survived things he wished he hadn't. James's voice, memory clear as yesterday morning. "Maggie, if I don't come back, don't let it make you hard. Don't let it turn you into something you're not. That's not who we are." She'd promised, then broken that promise every day since the telegram. "There's more," she heard herself say. "In the basket, if you're still hungry." The afternoon was quieter. The men worked. Margaret watched. Franklin said nothing, but she felt his approval, his relief that she hadn't become what grief wanted to make her. At sunset, the truck returned. 12 men climbed in. 12 faces Margaret could now identify as individuals. The older one who'd explained about Ernst, Hans the youngest who'd eaten 3 sandwiches and looked less likely to collapse, the one with the scar across his cheek, the one who limped, the one with careful hands who'd stacked the cotton sacks with geometric precision. And Ernst Weber, who met her eyes for just a second before climbing into the truck. She saw gratitude there, and shame, and something else. Something like hope, fragile as spiderweb. The truck pulled away, dust settled. The sun touched the horizon, painting Texas sky the color of fire. Franklin came to stand beside her. "You did right today, Maggie girl." "Did I?" Her voice was small. "I don't know what I did. You saw them, that's all. Just saw them as people. That's harder than most folks manage in wartime." She pulled the telegram from her pocket, looked at it in the fading light. They might have killed him, Dad. Might have, might not have. Either way, they're here now, and James is gone, and we have to decide who we're going to be. He paused. Who James would want us to be. Margaret folded the telegram carefully. "They're coming back tomorrow. Every day till harvest is done, probably longer." She nodded, looked at the fields where 12 men had worked, at the barn where James's photograph watched over empty space, at that old oak where a German soldier had cried over a sandwich. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "I'll bring more food." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her childhood bed in the room where she'd dreamed of college and adventure before the war changed everything, and thought about Ernst Weber's hands, how they'd shaken, how thin they were, how they'd trembled when he took that sandwich. She thought about propaganda posters in town. "Defeat the Axis. This is the enemy. Images of Germans as monsters, beasts, inhuman things that needed to be destroyed. But monsters didn't cry over sandwiches. Beasts didn't look at photographs of dead soldiers with that expression of shared pain. The questions wouldn't stop. Would she ever know what happened to James in his final moments? Was he afraid? Did he suffer? Did he call for her, for home, for anyone? Were there German mothers asking the same questions about their sons? Were there German sisters carrying telegrams in their pockets, wearing grief like she wore hers? And the biggest question: what if the real enemy wasn't these men in gray uniforms, but something larger? Something that turned people into soldiers and soldiers into names on casualty lists. She heard Franklin moving downstairs, making coffee at 2 a.m. the way he'd done since 1918, when sleep became something other men did. Margaret rose, found him at the kitchen table, coffee steaming, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Haven't slept right in 26 years. Don't expect to start now." She sat across from him. Outside, Texas night was full of cricket song and distant coyote calls. "Tell me about your war," she said. "Why? Because I need to understand how you came back and didn't hate them. How you still believe people are good." Franklin was quiet for a long time. Then, "I was 19 in the trenches, 6 months staring at Germans doing exactly what I was doing. Freezing, starving, waiting to die. Christmas Eve 1917, we heard them singing. Silent night. Same words, same God, same hope for peace." He looked at her. "How do you hate someone who knows the same carols? But they were still the enemy." "They were. I killed some. They killed some of us. Then it was over and I had to choose. Be the man who killed them or be the man who survived them. Be the hate or be something else." "What did you choose, sir?" "I chose to remember they were just men, following orders, believing what they were told, same as me." He reached across the table. "You saw Ernst today, saw him cry. You know what that means. That he was hungry, that he's human, that whatever he did in the war, he can still cry over kindness." Franklin squeezed her hand. "James wouldn't want you carrying this hate, Maggie. He was too good for that." Margaret felt tears on her face, first tears she'd cried in front of anyone since the telegram. "I miss him so much." "I know, baby girl, I know." They sat in the dark kitchen while the night rolled on. Tomorrow 12 men would return. Tomorrow Margaret would choose again. The wall or the crack in the wall. The hate or the humanity. She didn't know yet which way she'd fall. But for the first time since James died, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a choice to make. And lying in bed later, sleep finally coming as dawn approached. Margaret thought about Ernst's hands again. How young they were. How broken. She thought about a question she'd never asked before. What was his first name? Did he have family? Did someone love him the way she'd loved James? The questions scared her, because questions led to understanding, and understanding felt like betrayal of everything James had died for. But his voice was in her head again. "Don't let it make you hard, Maggie." Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd ask just one question, just to see what happened when you treated an enemy like a person, just to see if the wall could crack a little wider. The second day, Ernst Weber arrived wearing a pair of gray wool gloves despite the August heat. Margaret noticed because everyone else had bare hands, but Ernst kept those gloves on even as sweat darkened his collar. She didn't ask about them, not yet, but she noticed, and the questions kept accumulating like debts she didn't know how to pay. The second week of September, Margaret brought lemonade to the south field. She told herself it was practical. The men worked hard. Dehydration would slow production. This was about efficiency, nothing more. But the truth sat heavier. She'd spent 6 nights thinking about Ernst Weber crying over a sandwich, about those wool gloves he never removed, about the way he worked like labor itself could somehow pay for sins she didn't know but suspected were terrible. She carried a ceramic pitcher and 12 tin cups on a tray her mother had used for church socials. The men were spread across 4 rows, moving through cotton with the methodical precision of soldiers who'd learned efficiency was survival. Klaus Müller walked the perimeter, maintaining order even in captivity that should have broken his rigid discipline. Franklin saw her coming, raised an eyebrow, said nothing, just took the tray and set it on the Ford's tailgate. "Water break," he called. Then in German learned 3 decades past, Wasserpause. The men came slowly, still uncertain, still waiting for the American kindness to reveal itself as trap or trick. Müller came first, always first, keeping the old hierarchy alive in this new world. Margaret poured, handed cups to men whose names she was learning despite herself. The older one was Johann. The one with the scar was Dieter. The careful one was Friedrich. And Hans, the youngest at 19, took his cup with both hands like it might escape. Ernst came last, always trying to disappear. She handed him the cup. Their fingers touched. His were rough despite the gloves he'd finally removed. Calloused, marked with small scars she recognized as barbed wire cuts. "Thank you," he said in careful English, 2 words that sounded like prayer. And Margaret asked the question she'd promised herself she would ask. "What's your first name?" Ernst looked up, surprised. Prisoners didn't have first names, they had numbers, ranks, designations. They were the enemy that captured the defeated, not people whose mothers had named them. "Ernst," he said quietly. "Ernst Weber." "Ernst." She tried the sound, foreign, German, but human. "I'm Margaret. People call me Maggie." Müller turned sharply, stared. The rules were explicit: no fraternizing, no personal conversations, no friendship between conquered and conqueror. But Franklin was there, standing between them and Müller's hard gaze. "Man's got a name," he said mildly. "No harm in knowing it." The moment passed. Ernst took his water and stepped back. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. Margaret had asked. Ernst had answered. And now he was Ernst, not just another gray uniform in a war that wouldn't end. September became rhythm. Sunrise arrival, sunset departure, cotton and corn and fence posts and the 1,000 tasks that kept a farm breathing while every American man who could fight was somewhere else fighting. Margaret watched Ernst. Didn't mean to, couldn't help it. Watched how he worked with quiet intensity like the labor was penance for something. Watched how he sometimes stopped mid-motion, lost in memories she couldn't reach. Watched how he ate his midday meal slowly, carefully, like each bite was grace he didn't deserve. And she watched those gloves, how he'd wear them in the truck, remove them for work, put them back on immediately after, like they were armor, like they protected something precious. On a Tuesday in mid-September, she found him alone under that old oak during the meal break. The other men played cards, shared cigarettes. Franklin provided, talked in low German about home and war and the strange mercy of American captivity. Ernst sat with his back against the trunk, eyes closed. Those gloves beside him on the grass. Margaret sat down, didn't ask permission, just sat. He opened his eyes, looked at her, waited. "You're different from the others," she said. "Yes." "Why?" Ernst was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his English came slow, each word carefully chosen. "I was teacher before war. Literature, poetry. I teach children about Goethe, Schiller, Heine. Beautiful words about beautiful ideas. And then Hitler. Then books burn, then beautiful words become dangerous. Then they give me rifle, say now you fight, now you kill, now you are soldier, not teacher." He looked at his hands, turned them over like evidence. "These hands hold books. Now they hold gun. Now they do things I cannot speak about." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. "My brother wanted to be a doctor, was studying at Texas A&M, then Pearl Harbor. Then he was a Marine. Then he was dead on a beach in France." Ernst closed his eyes. "I am sorry. Are you—" The question came harder than she meant it. "Really, or is that just what you say?" He opened his eyes. met her gaze directly. I am sorry that war makes us into things we are not. Sorry that good men die because other men tell them to. Sorry your brother never becomes doctor. Sorry I never teach again. Sorry for all of it. They sat in silence, heavy with shared loss. Did you kill anyone? Margaret asked. Needed to ask. Needed to know. Yes, just that. No excuses, no explanations, just yes. Did you want to? No. But I do it anyway because if I do not, they shoot me, and I want to live. Even when living feels like dying, I want to live. His voice cracked. I am coward. No, Margaret said, meant it. A coward wouldn't admit it. The meal break ended. Ernst stood, started to walk away, stopped, turned back. You ask why I am different. I tell you, other men they still believe Germany is right, believe war is necessary, believe Hitler knows what he does. They are prisoners of war. I am prisoner of myself. That is difference. He walked back to the cotton, leaving Margaret under that spreading oak, thinking about cowardice and courage and the murky space between them. The English lessons started by accident. Late September, Ernst was repairing fence posts near the barn. Margaret was supposedly doing accounts but found herself watching him work. He was singing something under his breath. German words she couldn't understand, but the melody was haunting, beautiful, sad. What's that song? She called. He stopped, looked embarrassed. Old song from home. About autumn, about leaves falling, about time passing. Teach me. Why? Because I want to know. So he taught her. Der Herbstwind weht. The autumn wind blows, phrase by phrase. His German, her English. Her pronunciation was terrible. He tried not to smile at her massacred vowels. Failed. Then she was teaching him. English words he needed. Names of tools, types of crops, bigger words too. Democracy, freedom, justice. One afternoon in early October, she tried to explain forgiveness. Forgiveness, Ernst repeated slowly. What means this? It means letting go of anger, choosing not to hold grudges, giving someone another chance after they hurt you. He frowned, thinking hard. In German we say Vergebung, but is not same. Vergebung is religious word, from God, not from person to person. Maybe that's the problem, Margaret said. Maybe we wait for God to forgive when we should be doing it ourselves. Ernst studied her face. Can you forgive? I don't know, she said honestly. I'm trying. The lessons became routine. 30 minutes after the midday meal while other men rested, Ernst and Margaret under the oak tree trading words like gifts. Franklin watched from a distance and said nothing, but Margaret saw approval in his eyes. Muller watched too, and his eyes held something else entirely, something dark and growing darker. October brought cooler weather and new tension. Letters from Germany started arriving, sporadic, heavily censored, but real. The news was universally bad. Cities bombed into rubble, food increasingly scarce, families displaced, missing, dead. The war that seemed almost abstract in the comfortable captivity of Texas suddenly felt close and cruel. Muller gathered the men one evening just before the truck came. Margaret was close enough to hear him speaking rapid German voice, hard as iron. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was reminding them who they were, what they'd sworn, why they shouldn't get comfortable, why they shouldn't forget. His eyes found Ernst, found Margaret standing 20 feet away. The message was unmistakable. That night, Franklin came into the kitchen where Margaret was peeling potatoes for tomorrow's meal. We need to be careful, he said. Of what? Muller's the kind who never stops fighting. War's still raging in his head, and he's seeing things that make him dangerous. What things? Franklin looked at her steadily. You and that young man, the way you talk, the way you look at each other, the way you're both changing. I know what you're just doing, and it's good, it's human, but to Muller, Ernst is betraying everything. And men like Muller, they don't forgive betrayal, they punish it. Margaret's hands stilled in the cold water. You think he'd hurt Ernst? I think war does terrible things to men's minds. Makes them hard, makes them cruel, makes them willing to hurt their own people to preserve an idea. Franklin put his hand over hers. Just be careful, Maggie girl. But careful wasn't enough. November 3rd, late afternoon. The work was nearly finished. The men were gathering tools, preparing for the truck. Ernst was at the far end of the field, completing the last row, working alone. Margaret saw Mueller walking toward him, saw two others following Johann and Dieter. Something in how they moved made her stomach drop. She started running. Mueller's voice carried across the field, harsh, angry, accusing Ernst of things Margaret couldn't understand but could imagine. Ernst was backing away, hands raised, trying to explain, trying to calm, trying to avoid what was coming. It didn't work. Mueller hit him once, twice. Ernst went down. The other two kicked him. Not wild, methodical, practiced, brutal. Margaret was screaming, running. Franklin was coming from the barn, moving faster than any 55-year-old man should move. They pulled the prisoners off. Mueller fought until Franklin put him on the ground with one hard shove born of old infantry training. Johann and Dieter scattered like roaches in light. Ernst lay in the Texas dirt, blood from his nose, his mouth, curled on his side. Breathing, but not moving. "Get help!" Franklin barked. But Margaret was already kneeling beside Ernst, hands shaking. "Can you hear me, Ernst? Look at me!" He opened his eyes, tried to speak, coughed blood. "Don't talk, just don't move." The MP corporal arrived, took one look, started asking questions. Mueller stood silent, defiant, unrepentant. Ernst wouldn't explain, wouldn't accuse, just shook his head when pressed. "I fall," he said through broken lips. "I fall, that is all." "Like hell," the corporal said, but without Ernst willing to press charges, without witnesses willing to speak, regulations prevented action. They started loading prisoners, all except Ernst. Margaret stopped them. "He's injured. He needs medical attention. I'll take him to the base hospital myself." The corporal looked uncertain, looked at Franklin. "She's right," Franklin said. "Man gets hurt working our land, we're responsible. We'll get him treated, bring him back tomorrow." So Ernst Weber rode in the passenger seat of Margaret Sullivan's truck, bleeding into a clean towel as she drove him not to any hospital but to their farmhouse. "I should not," he said weakly. "Rules say, and to hell with their rules." She brought him inside, sat him at the kitchen table, brought water, clean cloths, iodine. Her hands were steadier now. Anger steadied them. Righteous fury at watching one broken man hurt another broken man over invisible lines and false loyalties. "Why?" she demanded while cleaning blood from his face. "Why did he do it? Because I forget. Forget what? That I am supposed to hate you." Ernst winced as she pressed too hard. "Mueller says I become American, says I betray Vaterland, says I am traitor worse than enemy." "You're not a traitor. You're just trying to survive." "Yes, but surviving means changing, and changing means betraying who I was before." He looked at her with eyes already swelling shut. "Maybe Mueller is right. Maybe I am traitor." Margaret grabbed his face, made him look at her directly. "Listen to me. Becoming a better person isn't betrayal. Learning, growing, seeing past the lies they fed you. That's not betrayal. That's courage." Tears ran down Ernst's face, mixing with the blood she was trying to clean. "I am so tired of fighting, Maggie. So tired." "Then don't. Just be here. Be now. Be Ernst, who teaches me German songs and learns English words and eats sandwiches under an old oak. Be that person. If I am that person, who was I before, who was man, who killed, who followed orders? If I let him go, where does he go? He goes into the past, where he belongs." Ernst closed his eyes. Let her finish cleaning his wounds. Let her bandage the worst damage. Let himself just for this moment be cared for instead of being the soldier, the prisoner, the enemy, the guilty. When Franklin came in, he found them at the table. Margaret with her hand on Ernst's shoulder. Ernst with his head in his hands. Both silent. Both processing something too large for words. "We can keep him tonight," Franklin said quietly. "Call it medical observation. But tomorrow he goes back. Can't change the system, Maggie." "I know." But that night she brought Ernst dinner on a tray. Real dinner. Pot roast her mother had been saving, potatoes, carrots, bread with real butter. Brought it to the small room off the kitchen where farmhands used to sleep before the Depression and the war took them all away. Ernst looked at the food like she'd brought him treasure beyond price. "Why are you kind to me?" he asked. "Because someone should be. Your brother, my brother would want me to be kind. That's who he was. That's who he'd still want me to be." Ernst ate slowly while Margaret sat in the doorway and watched. Outside, November wind rattled windows. Inside, warmth from the stove, smell of good food, quiet sound of someone eating who'd been hungry far too long. "Maggie," Ernst said, first time he'd used her name. "Muller is right about one thing. I am changing. Being here changes me, and I am afraid of what? That when war ends, when I go home, I will not fit there anymore. I will be man who knows Americans are not monsters. Man who speaks English. Man who cries over sandwich and learns about forgiveness. And Germany will not want that man. Will have no place for him. Then maybe you help build a new Germany. Better Germany. Or maybe," he said very quietly, "maybe I stay here, in place where I am allowed to change, where being different is not betrayal." The words hung dangerous and impossible between them. Words that meant treason to Muller and his kind. Words that meant hope to a broken teacher who'd never wanted to be a soldier. Margaret didn't answer, didn't know how. Just sat there as Ernst finished his meal, as the night deepened, as the war ground on somewhere far away. And this small act of human kindness stood against it, fragile and defiant and impossibly brave. The next morning, Ernst went back to the barracks, back to the other prisoners, back to Muller's cold stare and the unspoken threat in every glance. But something had changed. Other prisoners saw it, saw the bandages, saw that the Americans had taken him in, cared for him, fed him, saw that he'd survived Muller's punishment and come back stronger somehow. More certain. A few started asking Margaret questions during the midday meal. Careful questions, quiet questions, about America, about Texas, about how things really were here versus what propaganda had promised. Muller watched, seethed, waited. November became December. War news was mixed. Germany retreating in some places, fighting desperately in others. Christmas approaching. First Christmas in captivity for these 12 men. First Christmas without James for Margaret. On December 20th, Franklin suggested something Margaret never expected. "A real meal," he said, "for Christmas Day. Turkey if we can manage it. All the fixings. Let them have one day that feels like home instead of prison." Margaret looked at him. "Why?" "Because it's Christmas. Because they're far from home. Because someone should show them kindness." Her own words coming back from her father's mouth. Because someone should. "Okay," she said. "We'll do it." She didn't know yet that this Christmas dinner would break something open. Didn't know that Klaus Muller would receive news that would shatter his rigid certainty into 1,000 pieces. Didn't know that 12 men would sit at a table and remember what it felt like to be human instead of soldier person, instead of prisoner man, instead of weapon. December 24th, Margaret and her mother cooked all day. Turkey from a neighbor who'd saved his best bird, dressing with sage from the garden, sweet potatoes, green beans canned last summer, cornbread, apple pie, enough to feed 12 hungry men who'd spent too many Christmases hungry. Ernst helped set up tables under that old oak. His face had healed bruises fading to yellow and green. But something in his eyes had changed. Some wall had come down. He smiled now sometimes, taught other prisoners English words. Sang German carols while working, shared hope like it was contagious. Muller watched with growing fury. That evening, just before dinner, a military jeep pulled up. An officer climbed out, walked to where prisoners waited, called Muller's name. Everyone watched as Muller received the telegram, watched his hands shake as he read, watched his face crumble wall by wall as the words destroyed him. His wife, his daughter Anna, 6 years old, Dresden, Allied bombing raid, December 15th, 5 days ago, gone, both of them, gone. The hardest man Margaret had ever seen fell to his knees in Texas dirt and wept like a child whose world had ended. 30 years of military discipline shattered in seconds. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd fought for, everything he'd used to justify his cruelty and his certainty. Gone. All of it. Gone. Ernst moved first, walked to Mueller, knelt beside the man who'd beaten him, put his hand on that shaking shoulder. No words, just presence. Just humanity recognizing humanity in its rawest, most broken form. Franklin brought water. Margaret brought a chair. One by one, other prisoners gathered around, not as soldiers, not as Nazis or believers or fanatics, just as men who understood loss because loss was all any of them had left. That night they ate Christmas dinner in near silence. 12 German prisoners and 2 American farmers and 1 American woman who'd lost her brother and learned to see past her grief. The food was good, the company was broken, the moment was sacred. After dinner, Ernst approached Margaret. He held something small, wooden, rough carved but beautiful. "I make this," he said, "for you, for Christmas." It was a cross, small enough to fit in her palm, and carved into the base in careful letters, James Patrick Sullivan. Margaret's vision blurred. "Ernst, he is not forgotten," Ernst said simply. "I promise you this, he is not forgotten." She held the wooden cross, felt its weight, felt the care in each cut, each curve, felt the apology in it, the acknowledgement, the humanity. And she did something she never thought possible. She hugged him, this German soldier, this enemy, this teacher forced to fight, this man who'd cried over sandwiches and learned about forgiveness and carved her brother's name into wood so she'd know he understood. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." When she stepped back, she saw Mueller watching, but the hardness was gone, just emptiness now, just grief. She walked to him, held out her hand. "I'm sorry for what you lost." He looked at her hand, at her face, at the kindness he'd spent months fighting, and slowly, so slowly, he took it. "Danke," he said. "Thank you." And the war for just one moment stopped. The telegram came May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Margaret heard it on the kitchen radio, her mother's hands dusted with flour. Franklin reading yesterday's paper because new ones were scarce. The announcer's voice crackled with exhausted triumph. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and was now ash and memory. It was over. Margaret walked outside. The May morning was clear, bright, perfect. Birds sang in that old oak. Fields stretched green to the horizon. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. At noon, the truck arrived. 12 men climbed down, but they moved differently. No longer prisoners awaiting punishment, just men awaiting a future they couldn't imagine. Ernst found Margaret by the barn. His face was complicated relief and sorrow woven together. "It's over," she said. "Yes. How do you feel?" He was quiet for a long time. "I do not know. Should feel happy, yes. War is done. Killing stops. But I think about home, what I will find there, who is still living." He looked at her directly. "And I think about here, about leaving this place, about not seeing you again." The words sat heavy between them. "When will they send you back?" "Soon, I think. Weeks, maybe. Months. They must organize everything. Must process thousands of prisoners, must find ships." He smiled sadly. "Once they cannot wait to capture us, now they cannot wait to send us away." Work continued. June became July. July became August. News filtered back from Germany. Cities were ruins, Berlin divided, the country occupied, carved between victors, food scarce, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead, millions more displaced. Letters began arriving. Ernst received 3 in August. He read them alone at the field's edge, shoulders hunched against news no one should bear. His mother dead. Starvation. His father disappeared during Soviet advance, presumed dead. His younger sister Greta alive, barely, in a displaced persons camp near Munich. His brother's grave somewhere near Stalingrad, location unknown. His house gone. his school rubble, his students scattered dead, lost to war. Everything he'd left behind had been erased. Margaret found him that evening under the oak letters in his hands. Those wool gloves, his mother's last gift, beside him on the grass. "Everyone is gone," he said simply. "Everyone except Greta. She is 17. She has no one." Margaret sat beside him, didn't touch, just sat. "What will you do?" "Go back. Must go back. My sister needs me." He looked at the letters. "I read these and I think, why am I alive? Why do I survive when so many do not? I live here in Texas, eating good food, learning English, making friends, and they die, they starve, they suffer. How is this fair?" "It's not fair, but it's not your fault." "Feels like fault. Feels like I betray them by living well while they die badly." "Ernst." She waited until he looked at her. "You didn't choose this. You didn't choose capture. You didn't choose to come here. You just survived. And survival isn't betrayal." Muller would say different. Muller lost his family and learned that everything he believed was a lie. I think Muller might say different now. It was true. Klaus Muller had changed after Christmas. The rigid officer was gone. In his place, a quiet, broken man who worked hard, spoke little, and looked at the American flag with something like envy for a country that hadn't destroyed itself. September arrived with cooler nights. The announcement came September 15th. Repatriation would begin in October. 12 men would return to whatever Germany remained. Franklin organized a farewell dinner for the last Sunday in September. Real food, good food, the kind of meal that said, "We saw you, we knew you, you mattered." After dinner, Ernst walked with Margaret to the property's edge. Sun was setting, painting Texas sky in colors Germany would never see. "I have something for you," he said. He pulled out those gray wool gloves, the ones he'd worn despite heat, the ones his mother had knitted. The last thing she'd given him before war consumed everything. "My mother makes these," he said, voice thick. "Last thing she gives me before I go to war. I keep them. When everything else is lost, I keep them." He held them out. "I want you to have them." "Ernst, I can't. They're all you have left of her. Is why I give them. You give me something precious. You give me humanity when I forget I have it. You see me when others see only enemy. You save my life. Not physical life. The life that matters. Soul life. My mother would want me to give them to person who does this." Margaret took the gloves, felt wool soft and worn under her fingers, felt the weight of what they meant. "I'll keep them safe," she whispered. "I promise. And I will write to you, if you permit. Tell you about Germany, about Greta, about everything. And maybe you write back. Maybe you tell me about farm, about Texas, about America. And I remember there is still kindness in world. I'll write back. Every letter. I promise." They stood in dying light. Two people who should have been enemies. Two people who'd found something else instead. Something without a name in English or German. Something that transcended the war that brought them together and the peace tearing them apart. "I will miss you," Ernst said. "I'll miss you too." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a photograph. Old faded corners soft from handling. "This is picture I give you. First day. Remember, you keep safe for me." Margaret remembered. The photograph handed to her with shaking hands face down. She'd put it in a drawer. Forgotten it in the months that followed. "What is it?" "Turn it over." She did. Saw a woman's face. Older kind, smiling at the camera. Written on the back in German script, "Sei freundlich zu jedem, der das findet." What does it say? "Be kind to whoever finds this," is my mother. Last thing she tells me before war, be kind. Even to enemies, even when hard, be kind. His voice broke. She knows somehow. Knows I will need to remember this. Margaret looked at the photograph. At this German woman who'd raised her son to be kind. Who'd sent him to war with a message of humanity. Who'd died hungry while her son ate well in Texas because strangers chose kindness. "She would be proud of you," Margaret said. "I hope so. I hope she sees somehow that I remember, that I try." The truck came October 3rd. 12 men loaded their few belongings. 12 men who'd arrived as enemies, leaving as something else. Not quite friends, not quite American, but not enemies anymore. Ernst was last to board. He stopped at the gate, looked back at the farm, at fields he'd worked, at the oak where he'd learned forgiveness, at Margaret standing there holding his mother's gloves, watching him leave. He raised his hand. She raised hers. Then he was gone. The farm felt empty after. Margaret tried returning to old rhythms. Work, routine, small rebellions against grief that kept a person moving through identical days. But the oak remembered. The kitchen remembered. The barn where James's photograph still hung remembered. 2 weeks after Ernst left, the first letter arrived. Written in careful English on thin paper that had crossed an ocean. Handwriting precise, each letter formed with concentration of someone writing in a foreign language. Dear Maggie, I am in Germany now. I find Greta. She is alive but very thin, very tired. We have small room in building that was once school. Many people here all looking for family, for home, for future that seems impossible. Germany is not like I remember. Cities are broken, people are broken, everything is broken. I walk through streets and do not recognize this country. This is my home, but it is not my home. I think about farm, about oak tree, about lemonade in August heat, about Christmas dinner, about your face when I give you cross with James's name. These memories keep me strong. Thank you for letting me know there is still good in world. I do not forget this. I never forget. Your friend Ernst. Margaret read it 3 times, then she sat down and wrote back. Dear Ernst, Greta is lucky to have you. Hold tight to each other. Family is what survives when everything else is lost. The farm is quiet without you all. Strange how 12 German prisoners became part of the rhythm here. That old oak looks empty without men sitting in its shade. I kept your mother's gloves in a box with James's things. Seemed right somehow. 2 people I loved, 2 pieces of them together. Write again when you can. Tell me everything. Good and bad. I want to know. Your friend Margaret. The letters became lifeline. Ernst wrote every few weeks. Margaret answered every letter. A conversation stretched across an ocean, across the gap between victor and vanquished, across the slow years of Germany's reconstruction. Ernst wrote about Greta, about how they scraped by, about American GIs who sometimes shared rations, about the slow, painful work of rebuilding a country that had destroyed itself. Margaret wrote about the farm, about Franklin's health declining, about seasons passing, about the world moving forward while she stayed in the same place doing the same work, waiting for something she couldn't name. 47 letters over 6 years. 47 windows into 2 lives, learning how to exist in a world supposedly at peace. But that didn't feel peaceful yet. In 1951, Ernst's letter was different. Dear Maggie, I have been thinking. Greta is married now. She has husband, has life. She does not need me anymore. Germany is rebuilding, but I do not fit here. I try, but I am man who knows America is not monster. Man who speaks English. Man who remembers kindness, and here this is not popular. Here we are supposed to forget, move on, pretend we were all victims, none guilty. But I remember what I did, what we all did, and I cannot forget, do not want to forget. So I think maybe I apply for visa, maybe I try to come to America, maybe I try to build life in place where I am allowed to remember, to change, to be different person. But I do not want to presume. Do not want to burden you. So I ask, would you sponsor me? Would you help me come back to Texas? I understand if answer is no. But I must ask. Your friend always, Ernst. Margaret read the letter in the kitchen. Franklin was there, older now, slower but still sharp. What's it say, Maggie girl? She handed it to him, watched him read, watched his face. What do you think? She asked. I think that young man saved your life same as you saved his. I think he belongs here. I think James would have liked him. Franklin looked at his daughter. I think you should say yes. So she did. The paperwork took months. Immigration forms, sponsorship applications, character references, proof of employment, proof of housing. The bureaucracy of a country deciding whether to welcome back a man who'd once been its enemy. But in May of 1952, 7 years almost to the day after the war ended, Ernst Weber stepped off a ship in New York Harbor. Margaret was there to meet him. She'd driven 18 hours straight, couldn't wait even one more day. When she saw him walking down the gangplank, older now, still thin but healthier, she felt something break open in her chest. Something locked tight since the telegram about James. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Ernst saw her, stopped walking, just stood there staring like he couldn't believe she was real. Then he was running, and she was running, and they met somewhere between the ship and shore, between Germany and America, between who they'd been and who they were becoming. "You came," he said. Stupid thing to say, obvious, only thing to say. "Of course I came. I think maybe you change your mind. Maybe you realize it's too much, too complicated." "Ernst," she held his face in her hands. "You're not too much. You're not complicated. You're home. Welcome home." He cried then, right there on the dock. Didn't care who saw, just cried. And Margaret held him and thought about his mother's message. Be kind to whoever finds this. How kindness had brought them here to this dock, to this moment, to this impossible second chance. Ernst became part of Sullivan Farm, not as prisoner, not as labor, as family. He lived in the farmhand's room and worked the land and learned to be American in all the small ways that mattered. The town wasn't sure what to make of him at first. A German. Here, working Sullivan land. Some folks wouldn't look at him. Others spit when he passed. But Ernst kept his head down, worked hard, let his actions speak. It was children who broke the ice. The neighbors' kids curious about the man with the accent. Ernst carved them wooden toys, taught them German counting songs, told them stories about a faraway place called home. Slowly, suspicion became acceptance. By 1960, he was Ernst from the Sullivan place. By 1970, just Ernst. The German part faded into background, less important than the man himself. He became a citizen in 1957. Took the oath with hand on heart and tears on face. Margaret and Franklin stood beside him. The family he'd chosen. The family that chose him. Franklin passed in 1964. Ernst spoke at the funeral about the man who'd taught him that former enemies could become friends. That forgiveness was stronger than hatred. That some wars end on battlefields, but others end in quiet moments when people choose to be kind. Ernst married in 1966 a widow from the Lutheran church in town named Catherine. She had 3 children from her first marriage, 2 boys and a girl. Ernst adopted them, became their father, taught them German and English, taught them about his mother's message, be kind, always be kind. Margaret never married. She poured her life into the farm, into the community, into being Aunt Maggie to Ernst's adopted children. They called her that without irony, without remembering she'd once been sister of a man killed by Germans. She was just Aunt Maggie who always had cookies and patience and stories about the old days. The 70s brought change. The farm expanded, the town grew. The generation that fought the war was getting old, starting to die off, starting to pass into history. But Margaret and Ernst remained. 2 constants. 2 people whose friendship had outlasted the war that created it. In 1984, on a warm September afternoon, they sat under that old oak. Same tree where Ernst had first cried over a sandwich. Same place where Margaret had first taught him the word forgiveness. Same spreading branches that had witnessed their transformation from enemy and victim to friends who were family. Ernst was 64 now. Margaret was 68, both showing the years, both carrying memories no one else could truly understand. "You ever regret it?" Ernst asked. "Sponsoring me, bringing me back?" "Never, not once. Only that I could not bring my mother. Could not show her what became of her message, could not tell her that it worked, that kindness saved me." Margaret reached into her pocket, pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "I want to show you something." She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a frame. and inside the frame the wool gloves, gray, worn, precious beyond measure. "I've kept them all these years," she said, "kept them safe like you asked. And I want you to know, Ernst, what they mean to me. They're proof that people can change, that enemies can become family, that your mother was right about everything." Ernst touched the glass covering the gloves. "She would like you very much, I think. Would say, 'This is daughter I wish I had.' And James would have liked you. Would have called you brother, I think. Would have been glad we found each other." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after decades of friendship, after all words have been said and all that's left is understanding. "Maggie," Ernst said eventually, "there is something I never tell you, something I should have said years ago." "What's that?" "That day, August 15th, 1944, when we arrive, when I see you standing at gate holding photograph of James, I make promise to myself." He looked at her. "I promise that if I survive this, if I live through being prisoner, I will become man worthy of your kindness. I will become man who deserves second chance. And every day since, every single day, I try to keep that promise." Margaret felt tears on her face. You kept it every day. Because of you. Because you see me when I cannot see myself. Because you choose forgiveness when you have every reason to choose hate." The sun was setting, painting the sky the colors of August 1944 when everything began, when 12 prisoners arrived and one woman chose to see them as human. "We saved each other," Margaret said. "That's what really happened. I was drowning in grief and you were drowning in guilt, and we pulled each other to shore." Ernst nodded. "Is good way to say it." They sat until dark. Two old friends, two survivors, two people who'd found in each other proof that war doesn't have to win, that humanity persists, that small acts of kindness can echo through decades. 21 years later, in 2005, Margaret Sullivan was 89 years old. Ernst Weber was 85. Both still living, both still on the farm, both still remembering. Ernst's wife, Catherine, had passed in 2002. Two of his adopted children lived nearby. The third was in California. He had 7 grandchildren who called him Opa and knew his story, knew he'd been a prisoner, knew Aunt Maggie had saved him, knew about the gloves and the cross and the Christmas when everything changed. Margaret's health was failing. The doctor said maybe a year, maybe less. Her body was giving out piece by piece the way bodies do when they've lived long and worked hard. On a May morning, May 8th, exactly 60 years after victory, Ernst found her sitting under that old oak. Same tree, always the same tree. He sat beside her, took her hand, thin now, fragile, blue veins visible under translucent skin. "Remember," she said, "just that one word. Always," he answered. "The first day, the way you cried, the way you gave me lemonade anyway. Christmas, Muller breaking down. You offering him your hand. The letters, 47 letters, 47 windows into hope. The gloves, my mother's message. Be kind, be kind." They sat, remembered, let decades wash over them like waves, let memories settle into their proper place, not as individual moments but as tapestry. A life, 2 lives, woven together by chance and choice and stubborn refusal to let hate win. Margaret looked at the farmhouse, at the barn where James's photograph still hung, at the fields Ernst had worked as prisoner and later as partner, as family, as the son Franklin never had. "You know what I think," she said. "What I think James is proud of us, wherever he is. I think he's proud we chose love over hate, forgiveness over vengeance, future over past. I think my mother is proud too. I think she knows her message found the right person." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We did good, didn't we, you and me? We took something broken and made it beautiful. We did. Promise me something. Anything. Tell the story, when I'm gone. Tell it to your grandchildren. Tell it to anyone who will listen. Tell them that enemies became family. Tell them that forgiveness is real. Tell them that small acts of kindness can change the world." I promise, Ernst said, and meant it with every cell of his body. Margaret closed her eyes, felt sun on her face, felt Ernst's hand in hers, felt 61 years since that August morning when 12 prisoners arrived and her life changed forever. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for letting me save you, for saving me back. Thank you, Ernst whispered, for seeing me, for teaching me forgiveness, for being my family. They sat under that spreading oak until evening, until shadows grew long, until it was time to go inside. And when Ernst helped Margaret to her feet, when he supported her weight as they walked slowly back to the house, he thought about his mother's gloves in their frame on Maggie's wall, thought about James's photograph in the barn, thought about all the ghosts that had brought them here, and he thought about the future, about his grandchildren who would know this story, about generations to come who would need to hear it, about how war creates enemies but humans create families, about how the strongest weapon against hatred is the simple, stubborn choice to be kind. Inside the house, Margaret paused at the doorway, looked back at that old oak, at the fields, at the farm that had witnessed everything. It was a good life, she said. The best, Ernst agreed. And in that moment, with Texas sun setting behind them and 61 years of friendship holding them upright, they understood the truest thing: war makes enemies. But kindness makes family, and forgiveness creates peace that echoes through generations. Teaching each new age that love is always stronger than hate, that mercy is always braver than vengeance, and that the courage to change is the greatest victory of all. The farm remembered. That old oak remembered, and those who came after would remember too, carrying forward the legacy of a German prisoner and an American woman who chose to see each other's humanity when the world demanded they see only enemies. Be kind to whoever finds this. The message endured, the story endured, the love endured, and that was enough. That was everything.